Okay, great. Good evening. It's a pleasure for me to be here, and I would like to thank the Soho Forum for sponsoring this debate. In arguing for this resolution, I want to make it clear from the outset that there is no debate whatsoever as to whether or not atmospheric CO2 or carbon dioxide is a so-called greenhouse gas. When present in the atmosphere, this one carbon and two oxygen molecule indeed has the capacity to absorb infrared radiation and warm the planet. There is also no debate as to whether or not the concentration of atmospheric CO2 is rising. Over the past 2 centuries, it has increased from a meager 0.028% of the atmosphere by volume to a still meager 0.041% today. Furthermore, there is no argument that global temperatures are warmer today than they were 50, 100, or even 200 years ago. The topic or question which is open to discussion, however, and for which we are all here this evening, is whether or not the modern increase in atmospheric CO2 has caused or is presently causing dangerous global warming. Warming so severe that it is threatening life all across the planet. Supporters of the dangerous CO2-induced global warming hypothesis, whom I will hereafter refer to affectionately as climate alarmists because of their concern or alarm about this issue, typically cite the high degree of correlation that exists between historical proxy records of temperature and atmospheric CO2 as empirical support for their thesis. And to that end, you have all likely seen some version of this figure, which displays historic temperature and CO2 reconstructions from the Vostok ice core in Antarctica for the past 400,000 years. Now, given the strong relationship that exists between these two variables, showing that higher levels of atmospheric CO2 coincide with warmer temperatures, while lower levels of CO2 correspond with colder ones, climate alarmists make the inference that changes in atmospheric CO2 caused the historic changes in temperature. And because atmospheric CO2 is a greenhouse gas, they thus contend that any rise in CO2 beyond the upper bound of its historic concentration of the recent geologic past will unequivocally cause unprecedented global warming. Furthermore, they opine, as noted in the recent Paris Climate Treaty and elsewhere, that such warming becomes dangerous when planetary temperatures reach a threshold of 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial values, due to a host of temperature-induced climate-related catastrophes. And they claim that the only hope to avoid such disaster and destruction, which they say is already underway, is for society to immediately reduce and scale back its CO2 emissions in order to achieve a policy of net zero emissions by 2050. But how accurate is this narrative? In answering this question, let us return to our previous figure and examine the historic temperature and CO2 records more critically. Certainly, these two variables experience a fairly high degree of correlation over the time period shown. However, it doesn't take a rocket scientist, or in this case, a climatologist, to recognize and understand the fact that correlation among two variables does not prove causation. Every textbook on statistics will teach you that. And they will also teach you that a hypothesis of causation among two variables can be rejected if there is no statistically significant correlation between them, or if the correlation fails to be maintained in a consistent and expected manner across time. Applying such principles to the case we are considering here, we can therefore confidently state that if carbon dioxide is indeed the all-important control knob of temperature that climate alarmists claim it to be, then changes in atmospheric CO2 should always precede changes in temperature. And because CO2 is a greenhouse gas, to prove causation, those changes must always be such that a rise in CO2 induces a corresponding rise in temperature, whereas a decline in CO2 must always induce a corresponding drop in temperature. Current observation, or consistent observations to the contrary, if present in the historical record, would therefore serve to invalidate a causation claim, as well as demonstrate that atmospheric CO2 is nothing more than a bit player among the many factors that drive climate change. So, what do the records show? Many of you may be surprised to learn that the historic temperature and atmospheric CO2 records do indeed violate the aforementioned principles of causation, and they do so more often than they maintain them. Multiple peer-reviewed scientific studies, for example, have demonstrated that following the termination of each of the past several global ice ages, air temperatures have always risen well in advance of the increase in atmospheric CO2. In fact, during these glacial terminations, which represent the most dramatic warming events experienced on Earth over the past million years, the air's CO2 content does not even begin to rise until some 400 to 3,000 years after planetary warming starts. Now, this next slide illustrates the observed temporal lag in CO2 as produced by a team of researchers examining glacial termination 3 245,000 years ago. In particular, note the temperature proxy shown in red, which has been shifted by the authors to the left so as to match the rapid rise in atmospheric CO2 that followed 800 years later. And remember, this leading rise in temperature and subsequent lag in CO2 increase, which relationship is opposite climate alarmist expectations, is a consistent and proven feature at the termination of all ice ages in Earth's recent geologic history. Another violation of the principles of causation in the CO2 temperature relationship is witnessed at the onset of ice ages. Here, scientists report that temperatures always drop first at the start of the glacial periods, and they do so well before the air's CO2 concentration begins its decline. What is more, similar to glacial terminations, these data also indicate that the CO2 decreases observed at the beginning of the ice ages lag behind the temperature decreases, often by several thousand years. Other equally problematic findings in the CO2 temperature relationship have been discovered by scientists examining periods other than the onset or termination of the most recent ice ages, including times when CO2 rises and temperatures fall, times when CO2 falls and temperatures rise, or times when a change in either of these two variables or parameters evokes no change in the other. And once again, such changes in CO2 are typically observed to follow changes in temperature from hundreds to thousands of years. A more recent example of such contrary behavior is illustrated in this graphic of atmospheric CO2 and temperature during the current Holocene, where it is seen that for 7,000 of the past 10,000 years, atmospheric CO2 concentrations rose while air temperatures declined. Now think about that. If CO2 was indeed the potent climate-controlling greenhouse gas that climate alarmists claim it to be, global temperatures would not have declined 1.3 degrees Celsius in response to the concomitant 25 part per million increase in atmospheric CO2 that occurred over this period. Rather, this rise in CO2 should have warmed planetary temperatures, but it didn't. The harsh reality is, in conjunction with all the other conflicting and contrary observations I've already shown you regarding the historical relationship between atmospheric CO2 and temperature, it leaves little doubt that forces other than CO2 play a much greater role in controlling and driving changes in global temperature. And as one final example of this fact, we will next examine the most recent 150 years of the instrumental temperature record. Over this period, it is estimated that carbon dioxide concentrations increased about 40%, and global temperatures rose between 0.8 and 1 degree Celsius. According to many climate alarmists, some 3/4 to 100% of this observed temperature rise was of anthropogenic origin, most all of which warming they ascribe to the concomitant increase in atmospheric CO2. This is because, notwithstanding the plethora of observational data that demonstrate otherwise, the only narrative climate alarmists are willing to embrace regarding the CO2 temperature relationship is one in which atmospheric CO2 is a powerful greenhouse gas whose increase will always result in climate warming. And based upon that narrative, they have constructed multiple highly sophisticated, though imperfect, computer climate models, which do not surprisingly project dangerous global warming is underway in response to the modern and still ongoing rise in the air's CO2 content. Well, the historic record of CO2 and temperature relationship over the past 500,000 years certainly proves problematic to this thesis. In actuality, one really need only examine the most recent 150 years to recognize there is little or no rigorous evidence that rising concentrations of CO2 are causing dangerous global warming. One red flag that immediately pops up when focusing on this time period is the observation that despite a consistent and near exponential rise in atmospheric CO2 over the past 150 years, temperatures fluctuated between periods of both global warming and global cooling. In addition, it is difficult, if not impossible, for climate alarmists to adequately reconcile the fact that the two largest warming events that occurred in this record, the first between 1910 and 1945 and the second between 1975 and 2005, experienced nearly identical rates and magnitudes of warming, despite an atmospheric CO2 increase in the latter event that was 5 times that which occurred during the former event. Nor is it easy for climate alarmists to adequately explain without abandoning their CO2-induced global warming thesis how a 3-decade-long cooling event can follow a 3.5-decade-long warming event when the CO2 increase during the cooling event was twice that which occurred during the preceding warming event. The only way to properly reconcile each of these contrary observations is for climate alarmists to admit they have overestimated the warming power of atmospheric CO2. And if you haven't yet been convinced of this fact, I offer the following additional evidence. In this slide, a record of the historic temperatures of the past 4 ice age cycles is presented. Notice that the peak warmth of the preceding 4 interglacial periods was between 1 and 2 degrees Celsius higher than that observed during the current interglacial in which we now live, despite there being 45% more CO2 in the present atmosphere. Thus, even if temperatures were to warm another 1 or 2 degrees C above their current values in the near future, there is no way such warming can definitively be attributed to the additional CO2 humans have added to the atmosphere in the modern era, because the higher temperatures in each of the past 4 interglacials occurred under CO2 concentrations that were about half the value as they are today. Another problematic issue for climate alarmists is the recent global warming pause, or temperature hiatus. Despite an 11% increase in atmospheric CO2 over the past 2 decades, which increase represents 1/4 of the total increase in CO2 during the modern era, global temperatures have shown little, if any, warming. Not surprisingly, not one of their climate models predicted this temperature plateau. Expecting warming, they all failed to see it coming. And speaking of the models, according to theory inherent in all climate models, CO2-induced global warming of the past 40 years should show a unique fingerprint in the form of a warming trend that increases with altitude in the tropical troposphere, as indicated by the red and orange colors presented in the center of this figure and outlined in blue. Changes due to solar variability and other known natural factors do not yield this pattern. However, as shown in this next slide, real-world observations do not match this model expected theory. Each of the red bars on this graphic shows warming that should have occurred in the tropical upper troposphere over the period 1979 to 2017, as predicted by simulations from 102 different climate models. The average predicted warming rate over this nearly 4-decade-long period, as shown by the black horizontal dashed line, is 0.44 degrees Celsius per decade. In contrast, radiosonde measurements obtained in this portion of the atmosphere, as shown in blue, reveal that the actual warming rate is 3 times smaller than that predicted by the models. This divergence between model projections and observational data is even more evident in this next figure, which plots both predicted and observed temperature anomalies of the upper tropical troposphere. Once again, observational data reveal that the model-derived projections of CO2-induced global warming are running far too hot. So much so, in fact, that mathematical analyses confirm a statistically significant difference between the 2 temperature series. Now, that key fact alone is sufficient to provide more than enough of a credible scientific basis for invalidating all of the climate models and their associated predictions. In closing, considering each of these several evidences I presented to you, it is truly disingenuous for climate alarmists to claim with any degree of certitude that the modern temperature increase bears an anthropogenic fingerprint, or that rising atmospheric CO2 is causing dangerous global warming. There exists far too much data to the contrary. And because the models all fail in this regard, the global warming debate should really end here. For pretty much all of the additional ancillary climate-related predictions made by climate alarmists rely upon the unrealistic temperature rise predicted by their invalidated climate models. And thus, we have no alternative but to conclude that indeed there is little or no rigorous evidence that rising concentrations of CO2 are causing dangerous global warming and threatening life on the planet.